Ukraine uses Kursk's success to press Biden on lifting weapons restrictions. The White House isn't budging, but that could change. Ukraine's invasion of Russia has flipped the gloomy narrative of the war, and Kyiv is using its battlefield success to launch a new pressure campaign on the US to lift the last restrictions on the use of long-range weapons inside of Russia. But at least for now, the White House still isn't ready to do it. Come on, Biden, you got 6 months left. 6 months left. Pull the lever, pull the trigger. Ukrainian officials have been huddling with members of Congress, making public statements and meeting up with top US officials to get President Joe Biden to change his mind. Armed with the surprising result of the Kursk offensive, Kyiv is amping up the pressure in the run-up to the U.S. elections and the uncertain future of an American aid in 2025 and beyond. Specifically, they're pressing Biden and his top advisors to stop worrying about Russian escalation and allow Kyiv to fight the war in its own terms. The whole naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, has crumbled these days somewhere near Sudzha. President Volodymyr Zelensky said this week, that being, of course, a Russian town that was occupied. Referring to a Russian town taken by Ukraine. Thanks, Politico, I got it. While Biden has relented on previous concerns over long-range missiles, tanks, and F-16 fighter planes, the administration's restrictions on when and where to use U.S.-donated longer-range precision missiles has created immense frustration in Kyiv and among some backers in Washington and Europe. And while the Biden team is considering sending additional missiles, as Politico first reported, senior officials in the White House and the Pentagon continue to shoot down any suggestion that the administration is thinking about changing its policy when it comes to allowing Ukraine to use American weapons outside of very specific instances inside Russia near the border. They maintain Ukraine has the authorities it needs to win. Bull, look. If this was Ukraine asking to blow up airfields deep inside Russia that are not being used, but are being used for, say, aircraft storage, and the Ukrainians are like, but we can blow them up before they even put them in use. And America was like, no. We're not going to say all of Russia is okay to be used our weapons. Moscow's off limits. That'd be one thing to say, like, Moscow's off limits. But when you're talking about air bases that are 50 to 150 kilometers outside of Ukraine, that are being used to bomb military targets inside Ukraine, bomb civilian infrastructure, bomb electrical infrastructure, bomb children's hospitals, and say, no, you're allowed to fire across the border at ground targets, but you're not allowed to fire across the border at air bases, even though they're both being used to attack you. It doesn't make any sense. It's not logically consistent. I've complained about this a million times. I'll complain about it a million more. But it doesn't make any sense to me. It'd be one thing if the Ukrainians were asking to strike Moscow, if they're asking to strike the Kremlin. It'd be another thing if they were asking to just strike all of the stuff that was necessary for Russia to have a functioning nuclear arsenal. But they're asking to strike the air bases that are actively being employed in the bombing of Ukraine. They should be more than fair game. I don't buy that this will be such a dangerous escalation, and it will legitimately help the Ukrainians. Not only will it help them defend, because these air bases cannot be used to do sorties on Ukrainian positions anymore, but it'll also defend Ukrainian civilians, it'll defend Ukrainian infrastructure, it'll make it so less will have to be spent in repairing after the war is done. Like, I think take out the archer, not the arrow is a 100% legitimate philosophy. Anyway, that's my opinion. That's as hawkish as you can get me, is on this issue. Some inside the top echelons of the Biden national security apparatus believe Kyiv may be launching a public campaign in order to hedge against any potential significant loss of ground in Ukraine in the coming months, according to one person familiar with internal Washington-Kyiv conversations, which would not surprise me. Ukrainians say they need a freer hand and are still optimistic they can get there. There's some indication now that Biden might want to do something big on Ukraine, maybe lifting some of the restrictions before the election now that he's not running. One senior Ukrainian advisor said, there's no guarantee, but we're hearing that he's thinking about it. For more than 2 years, again, just make the restriction, you can strike any airbase that is actively bombing Ukraine. That is more than a legitimate restriction. That, in fact, is going above and beyond. You are saying, you are giving the Russians the options to not only, be like, okay, you know, we're going to allow all the air bases not being employed to not be struck. We're telling the Russians that. But we're also saying that if you stop using these air bases, then the permission to strike those air bases will be removed. So you can make those air bases no longer legitimate targets for our weapons. Like, this even gives the Russians some flexibility to lean more into diplomacy. And if they do stop using it, then that's one less air base being used to bomb Ukraine. If they do keep using it, well, then fire away. Either way, I think it works. For more than 2 years, Biden has resisted allowing Kiev's free use of American weapons during offensive campaigns inside of Russia, in fear of escalating tensions with Moscow. If he does change his mind, it would significantly alter the course of the war, giving Kiev the freedom it says it needs to win. Politico spoke to 8 officials in the US, Ukraine, and other parts of Europe who were familiar with the internal deliberations over the use of long-range weapons. All were granted anonymity to speak freely about the internal disagreement. Part of the deliberations involving allowing British-made Storm Shadow missiles and already in Ukrainian arsenal to hit Russian airfields and supply depots inside of Russia. Since the missiles contain U.S. components, and the Biden administration would have to agree to their use. The British government has yet to formally make the request, though it is conducting an internal review, and the Biden administration is aware of the issue according to officials on both sides of the Atlantic. Meaning the British could push this issue more, but they've chosen not to. Keir Starmer. One administration official said that using the Storm Shadow, or Army Tactical Missile System, long-range missiles that Ukrainians have for months wanted to use to strike inside Russia, might not be as effective as advertised. The Ukrainian military has a limited supply of the missiles, and those they do have may not be able to reach critical Russian targets, which have already been moved out of their range. Most significantly, 90% of the planes that launch glide bombs from Russian airspace at the Ukrainian civilian infrastructure have already been moved out of range of those missiles, a senior administration official said. The U.S. already allows the use of its long-range missiles inside of Russia, but only for defense, as counter-battery fire to hit Russian missile launch sites. Well, no. Partially for defense, to hit missile launch sites, but not to hit air bases that are being used to bomb. Our policy does allow for Ukraine to conduct counterfires to defend itself from Russian attacks. Some Russian attacks. This is a Pentagon statement, but they're not even being as specific as they should. Over the border region. And that border region does include Kursk, and it does include Sumy. And so they are defending themselves from Russian attacks within that region. The Ukrainian fighting inside of Russia are already using U.S.-made high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, for any of you more familiar with the abbreviation, to hit bridges, supply depots, and Russian units using precision munitions with U.S. blessing. Some prominent Democratic lawmakers said they're open to the U.S. allowing Ukraine more leeway in using American arms. Representative Jason Crow said he supports sending more long-range weapons to Kiev, including giving Ukrainians more flexibility on targeting and the use of those weapons. Crow said the war had changed from its early days, and the U.S. and allied policy needs to keep up with those changes. The risk of Ukraine losing is catastrophic for the world order, so the U.S. has to work to both manage the risk of escalation, but also lean in a way that maybe we wouldn't have in the first year in the conflict. Ukrainians' use of high-end U.S. weaponry shows that they've proven to be a responsible partner, and they've proven to know how to use this stuff and how to use it well. It's time we are very clear that the commitment that we're going to help Ukraine win this. Representative Calvert, a Republican from California, who chairs the panel that controls much of the Pentagon budget, likened the hesitancy of the administration to approve missile strikes deeper into Russian territory to its previous objections to providing Ukraine long-range munitions and F-16 fighters, among other debates. The Biden team eventually reversed course and sent those weapons. No, I can't believe I have to correct the Politico article. This is incorrect. The Biden team did send long-range munitions. The Biden camp has never sent F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. We gave approval for the Dutch and other countries to send their jets. Since these weapons originated in the United States as part of like international arms trading law, I forget the specific, I'm sorry, I can't remember the specific number or name of the law, but the country that sends weapons to other countries, for example, United States sending F-16s to the Netherlands, sells them. If they want to send those weapons anywhere else, the country of origin has to agree. And so we basically allowed other countries to give their weapons that we made and sold to them to Ukraine. We never sent any F-16s over to Ukraine, even though we have the largest F-16 stockpile in the world. And if there was any way we could get, Ukraine like 100 or 120 F-16s to give them a sizable air force, it would the quickest way to do it would be for us to do it, for the United States to do it. Problem is that would be very expensive. We need to approve it. It wouldn't be like expensive for the average American necessarily, but the money needed to be approved because of how expensive those aircraft are. The Biden administration seems to be of the view that it's probably just more cost effective to spend that money in artillery and other systems that are more desperately needed. And they think it'll take too long to get those jets in the air anyway. And that's why even though we're like 2.5 years in, there's only 10 F-16s in the sky currently in Ukraine. Calvert criticized the administration for blocking the wider use of US-made long-range systems, arguing holding back the Ukrainians will prolong the war. Obviously in Kursk, they would like to have used long-range fire, specifically ATACMS. I mean, if these ATACMS could hit the air bases that they're currently hitting with these long-range drones, there would be a lot less surviving Russian aircraft. They just pack more of a punch, they're more likely to hit on target, they're more likely to be accurate, they're just a better system for taking out air bases. There's some fear and trepidation on the part of the administration. At some point, the war needs to end, and unless the Ukrainians can defend their territory by attacking the supply chain that's moving the Russian military operations, it's going to be difficult to bring them to the table. This advance that they had into Russia is encouraging, but it's going to be hard to sustain without them being able to utilize certain kinds of weapon systems. So I hope they're thinking about that a little bit. The Ukrainians have long tried to get the White House to ramp up its support by saying it will help Biden's legacy, arguing the administration will be remembered as either having helped Ukraine win or not doing enough by keeping the restrictions in place. It's about legacy, the advisor said. What does the Biden administration want their legacy to be on Ukraine? They have a chance to make a change, and we're advocating they make that change now. Biden has 6 months. This is a decision they should have made 6 months ago. A second Ukrainian advisor also pointed to the election and the uncertainty of what policies either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris might have concerning the use of U.S. weapons in Russia and continue funding for Ukraine in 2025 and beyond. You think Trump's going to approve strikes on Russian air bases? I mean, you're gonna have to roll like a nat 20. Zelensky is a nat 20 persuasion. Good luck. The argument has so far failed to move the president and other national security advisor Jake Sullivan. The Pentagon remains in lockstep with the White House's thinking. At the NATO summit in Washington in July, Ukrainian officials, including Andrei Yermak, a top advisor to Zelensky, if not his biggest advisor to Zelensky, Ukrainians hate him, asked the White House to consider lifting the ban. In July and August, the delegations of Ukrainian parliamentarians met on Capitol Hill with lawmakers, urging them to talk to the White House to urge the president to change his mind. At the beginning of August, a collection of bipartisan senators organized a meeting with Sullivan. Sullivan has at various times held meetings with senators to discuss Ukraine. But during the encounter, the delegation had one unified message. The administration needs to change its stance now before it is too late, according to a person who briefed them on the meeting. That's a much better way to approach it. The war is happening now. This isn't something you can continuously deliberate. If it's a hard decision to make, take like 24 to 48 hours where you sit down, talk about every scenario, put it all on a whiteboard, and make a decision, and then stick to that decision. But don't if you're thinking about it, you got to make the decision now because the war is happening now. And if you're not going to make the decision, then you've got to provide them with the short to long range air defense systems that can interject and intercept the attacks on their country, because you either got to shoot the arrow or you got to shoot the archer. It is probably more effective, cost effective to shoot the archer, but if you're not going to give them the munitions to do so, they're going to have to shoot down the arrow. The argument was similar to one they and many others, including Ukrainians, have made before. The U.S. should lift all restrictions, they say, because if it doesn't and Ukraine loses, the administration will be known as the one that didn't do enough when it could. The framing has at times angered senior officials in the White House. Tough shit. Sorry. Who insists Washington has done more than any country to help support Kiev and that it shouldn't have to risk its own national security for Kiev. Look, it is in part of America's national security interest that Ukraine wins. This is a part of Ukraine winning. Russia continues to cross every red line that there is, and there's more restrictions you could place on these that could continue to act as a disincentive for the Russians, including missile strikes on locations like Moscow, instead of just missile strikes that are on locations that are directly involved in the war that's ongoing. Officials in certain corners of the administrations, particularly inside the White House, have told the Ukrainians that the U.S. will eventually want to reset relations with Moscow, and lifting the restrictions could upend those efforts. This is the thing. While I agree that eventually there will be some form of a reset with whatever administration that is left, that doesn't mean necessarily that you forget what they did or what they're capable of, but there will be some moment where they want to reopen stuff. But that shouldn't restrict you from doing what is necessary to win now, because the Russians want to reopen relations with the United States just as much as we'll want to with them. We've got a nuclear arsenal too. We've got a much bigger economy than they do. We've got 1 million allies on their border. We're not even just talking about Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. What about Japan? What about Finland now? And of course, Ukraine. And there's also, of course, South Korea, but that's not really on their border, but it's close. It's basically on their border. Point is, like, they have good reason to want to keep open, clear communication with the United States. And I think the idea of the United States including, after we approve strikes right over the border to the ground forces that are attacking, approving strikes on the air bases that are actively bombing civilian infrastructure and nothing else is not going to be the final straw that makes the Russians believe that there's no use in ever talking to America again. The Russians were giving air systems and testing air defense systems in Vietnam, shooting down American aircraft. And it was their staff doing it sometimes too, testing it. So, I mean, like, why have the standards changed so much so quickly? Doesn't make any sense to me. You are bringing me new stuff, chat, all the time. You guys are so cute and adorable. Thank you.